Where are you doing it? I'm the sub. Oh, so Ryan's back here. Yes, I'm in a meeting. Well, it started Sunday. Yeah. Morning. Again. I think they're still not here. I have a book. He told me he wanted to cover 3 today and 4 on this year. Chapter 3 today and chapter 4. So that's what we'll try to do.
seat in the front row. I was thinking next Sunday, what happened to your truck? Your car?
You'll have to ask.
Uh-oh. Did it happen to her or because of her? Did it happen to her or because of her? Yes.
Gets better and All right, the clock says it's 9 o'clock. So it's time to begin in our new time. Welcome to our study of Ezra. I'm just the sub today, so that means, and Wednesday, so that means I need all of your help to be able to carry the study on today. So be ready to help. Be ready to do things and to talk. I've asked Gary to lead us in prayer to begin our class. So Gary, if you will.
Our gracious and loving God, how thankful we are that we can come together as brothers and sisters. Father, to glorify you for the God that you are, for the world that you made for us, the life that you give us. Father, we owe everything to you, and we're so thankful. Father, as we've just been in our group meetings to talk about those of our number that are having problems or needs or just going through tough times. Father, help us all to reach out to them, just to make phone calls, to let them know how loved they are, just to offer assistance, and just to give encouragement. Father, you knew your wisdom is so great that you knew we were going to need each other to survive this world and to take this journey through this life to get to you in heaven. Father, may we be that encouragement every day to our brothers and our sisters. We love you, and we thank you for Jesus, your Son, and it's in his name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Gary. Okay, Brian's assignment to me was to cover chapter 3 today and chapter 4 on Wednesday. So that's our plan, and that's what we'll aim to do. And then he will be back next Sunday, and I'll tell him where we got to, and you start with chapter 5. Hopefully by then you'll have your workbooks, and they haven't come in as yet. So we'll just use the good old book itself. All right, look at where were the people who returned at the end of chapter 2. Look at the verses right at the end of chapter 2. Where were they?
It says they arrived at the Lord's house in Jerusalem.
Yeah, where were the people though?
Where were they from?
No, where were they living?
Oh, they had settled in the towns.
Okay, so you get the idea that what did Jerusalem look like?
It was waste.
Yeah, all right. It was a waste. They were living in their towns, which means they were living outside of Jerusalem. So the question is, what was the condition of Jerusalem? And Philip, can I ask you to turn over to 2 Chronicles 36, just a few pages back, and read verses 17 through 19.
First Chronicles what?
2 Chronicles 36, 17 through 19. This is the account of Jerusalem being captured and what happened to it.
Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or aged. He gave them all into his hand, and all the vessels of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his princes, all these he brought to Babylon, and they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious vessels.
Thank you. So what was the condition of Jerusalem? It had been destroyed and burned by Nebuchadnezzar and the Chaldeans. And likewise, what was the condition of the temple? The same thing that happened to it. It was burned and destroyed. So that Jerusalem was a desolate place. If you look on down in this passage here in 2 Chronicles, down in verse 21, it says, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths, all the days it lay desolate. It kept Sabbath to fulfill the 70 years. So what that says is that during the time that the Jews were in exile, no one had occupied Jerusalem or its surrounds. And it was by the Lord's plan and purpose that that took place. And why was that the case? Yeah, so the land would have the rest that it did not have while the people were living there. They had not done a good job of observing the Sabbaths, the days of rest, the days holy to God. And so God exiled them and let the land lay desolate for that period of time. So when they came back, what they found was desolation in Jerusalem. And there was no place to live, so they were living in the towns outside of Jerusalem. But we're going to find during Ezra that God's plan was for Jerusalem to be repopulated and rebuilt. And then by the time we get to Nehemiah is going to rebuild the walls. So that by the end of this part of history, Jerusalem is going to be a city again, and it's going to have some designation as a city. It's going to be protected. All right, so let's look at, and I noticed Brian had a timeline here on the table. Maybe this one is more confusing to you, but I'll just point out, here's the decree of Cyrus, and here's when the people return and they begin to build the temple, which we're going to talk about a little bit today. And this is all covered in the first 6 chapters of the book of Ezra, which we're studying. The first return is under Zerubbabel as the leader, and it's during the time of Cyrus, who's the king, and these are the Persian kings down here at the bottom. And we're going to find that when the temple actually begins, the prophets Haggai and Zechariah become active and encouraging the temple. And then you'll find that there's a gap in Ezra between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7, when this is Zerubbabel returning and this is Ezra returning. The book of Esther takes place in there, and then the book of Nehemiah is sort of the last book of the history of the Old Testament, because after that, our record anyway goes silent for the 400 years or so. God doesn't speak again to anyone until we have a record of coming to Elizabeth and Zechariah to foretell the coming of John, some 400 years later. So we're still back here in the beginning of the return under Zerubbabel. How many people about came back with Zerubbabel? 42,000. It talks about men, and then it lists also about 7,000 servants. So round numbers, 50,000 people or so came back, men, and with Zerubbabel. So that's how many people are living in the land. All right, we're going to talk about them rebuilding the altar and rebuilding the temple. And my question to you is, how did they know where to put the temple and the altar? So look in chapter 2 and verse 68. And it says, some of the heads of the families, when they came to the house of the Lord that is in Jerusalem, made freewill offerings for the house of God to erect it on its site. What does that say to you?
They knew where it was.
They knew where it was. At least they found where the old temple had been, and they built it on the same site. We're not told how they found it. Maybe there were people there who had been alive, because it was 70 years that they were gone. They would have been children then. By the time they came back, of course, they would have been, I'll say, older men. And So either they remembered where it was, or they found the foundations, or they found something that let them know this was the site of the temple. So that they erected the temple on the site where it had been before, or that was their plan. What month did they gather? This is in chapter 3 now. The 7th month. In the Jewish calendar, that's the month of Tishri, and it comes in about our September, October. It's in the fall. The curious thing about the Jewish calendar is they had a civil calendar and they had a religious calendar, and they did not coincide. They were different months. So when you read months in the Bible, you're usually reading the spiritual calendar. So this was the 7th month, the month of Tishri, when they gathered in Jerusalem. And this would be of the year that they returned, which would have been 536 or 7 or somewhere in there. I hate to be very dogmatic about the years because we don't have a date in here. We have some dates of some of the kings.
Your months roughly 30 days, or did they vary?
Their months were roughly 30 days, and they had 12 months just like we did. And then they added a few days from time to time, because with a 360-day year, you'll get out of time with the sun and the moon and things like that. Your days will get messed up. So every few years they added a few days, just like we had a leap year, a leap day every 4 years. Do you remember what feast come in the 7th month? See how good you are at your Jewish feast schedule here. Yeah, it was an important month. There were 3 major feasts that came in the month of Tishri, in the 7th month. Peggy talked about the Feast of Tabernacles, which they're going to observe here in chapter 3. There was also the Feast of Trumpets that started the year. And the Day of Atonement also occurred in the 7th month, so a very important day. But we don't have any record of them celebrating the Day of Atonement, I think because they didn't have a temple yet, and this Day of Atonement required a ceremony at the temple. And also, there's no record that the Ark of the Covenant ever came back to Jerusalem with the people. And you remember that the Day of Atonement requires that the high priest go into the presence of God on the mercy seat at the top of the Ark on the Day of Atonement. So there's no record that they had the Ark. They had a lot of the vessels. You probably studied that in chapter 1 when they came back. But the 7th month was a very important month religiously for the Jews. Who were the 2 leaders? This is in verse 2. Jeshua and Zerubbabel. Now, why are those 2 leaders important? Who was Jeshua? His son of Josadak. And he was a high priest. He was the high priest. So Jeshua represents the religious leadership in the nation. Who was Zerubbabel? And why do we remember him? He's in the genealogy of Jesus, which says that he is a descendant of David. So what he's representing, the Jews don't have a king anymore because the Persian king is the king. There are some minor kings. Zerubbabel was apparently serving as a governor appointed by the Persians to be the governor over Judea. But he was the representative of the kings, the leaders in Israel. So these 2 guys together, the spiritual leader and the civil leader, are the ones who are activating this work that we find here in chapter 3. And you didn't say that Zerubbabel was the son of Shealtiel. All right. What work did they lead in chapter 3? They rebuilt the altar. Remember we said they found the site of the temple. So the altar was outside the temple building, but inside the temple compound. And so the first thing they did would be to rebuild the altar. And why would they do that?
They were going to have their sacrifices, which was part of their worship.
Okay. They wanted to reestablish the worship to God in the sacrificial system, and practicing the sacrificial system. So the first thing they did was to rebuild the altar. And why did they feel they needed to worship? Look at verse 3 and see if it gives you a clue.
They were fearful of the people of the land because they were exposed and they wanted to worship God and offer sacrifices to Him.
Exactly what it says, for fear of the people around them. We're going to talk a little more about this connection between fear and worship at the end, because I've got a question for you there about if that still relates to us today. And so think about that from now until we end the class, okay? But in this case, they were afraid of the people, so they wanted to establish the worship to God. They wanted to feel that connection with God according to the Mosaic law, the law that God had given through Moses to them that involved that sacrificial worship. So that was the reason that they established the altar. And that seems to be the reason they did that first before they did anything else. And what feast did they celebrate, Peggy? The Feast of Tabernacles. And what was the Feast of Tabernacles? What did it celebrate?
Wasn't it celebrate how they packed up and moved all through the...
They're coming out of Egypt,
yeah,
and then journeying in the wilderness where they lived in tents. So the Tabernacles was to commemorate that time when they were coming out of captivity into the promised land. So would that be appropriate in this case here? Very similar thing, isn't it? Although they're not slaves in Persia as they were in Egypt, they are captives in Persia. They have freedom that they didn't have in Egypt, but they are captives in Persia, and they're coming back to the land of promise. So they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles, which was a 7-day celebration. People lived in lean-tos or tents or temporary houses, which was probably appropriate for Jerusalem, because what did we say was the condition? Nowhere to live in Jerusalem. It had been destroyed. Now that's probably an overstatement. There were probably some places that you could live in Jerusalem because somebody had to maintain these feasts on this altar here that they built. And we'll talk about that a little bit more.
So my version calls it the Feast of Booths.
Feast of Booths, same thing. Tabernacles or booths, temporary living places. It's also called something else.
shelters.
Huh?
Mine version says shelters.
Shelters, okay, yeah, all the same idea. What other offerings besides the offering for the celebration of the Feast of Booths? What other offerings did they offer? Peggy, would you read Peggy Farrell, would you read verses 4 and 5 of chapter 3?
They celebrated the Feast of Shelters as prescribed and offered burnt offerings each day based on the number specified by ordinance for each festival day. After that, they offered the regular burnt offering and the offerings for the beginning of each month and for all the Lord's appointed holy occasions, as well as the free will offerings brought to the Lord.
Okay, so how much sacrificing was going on this altar? A lot. If you remember, look back, if you will, at Numbers 28. You'll find a record there of the daily sacrifice that they had to make.
28 and 12.
Yes, Numbers 28. I want to start with verse 1. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the people and say to them, my offering for food, for my food offerings, my pleasing aroma, you shall be careful to offer me at the appointed time. And you'll say to them, this is the food offering that you shall offer to the Lord. 2 male lambs, a year old, without blemish, day by day. So the minimum was 2 sacrifices each day. One, he says in verse 4, you shall offer in the morning, and the other you shall offer at twilight. And then there's also a a grain offering that goes along with those offerings. And then in that verse, it also talked about the sin offerings and the burnt offerings, the new moon offerings. So the sacrificial system, if you can sort of picture it in your mind, was a very bloody system. They were making sacrifices every day. And the message, to me anyway, is pretty clear that sin requires death. If there's sin, something's going to die. And under the sacrificial system, it was the lambs and sheep and goats that they sacrificed. And under the New Testament system, it was Jesus Christ, the one sacrifice for all time. So think of that. We think of the sacrificial system, and it seems foreign to us, but it's really a shadow of our New Testament cleansing under Jesus. Yes, Peggy.
And so if we fast forward, we see they had to rebuild the temple. So when Jesus was born, he had to have somebody go and teach.
Okay, yeah. Again, what we're seeing in this whole story is God's providence. Why did God bring the people back to the land after their exile in Persia? Or in Babylonia and then Persia? Why did he do that?
To discipline them mainly.
To discipline them was a reason for the exile. Why bring them back?
To show that promise
To show that his promise, God is always going to keep his promise. God is always going to keep his promise. And Peggy refers to Jesus and in the temple and having a place to teach. Jesus could have taught, did teach everywhere, didn't he? And not just in the temple. But that center in Jerusalem was necessary for the nation to held together, because God had said from the very beginning, especially from Genesis 12 on, that through the family of Abraham, he was going to bring the Messiah into the world. So it was necessary to complete that promise that God brought the people back, and that he maintained the genealogies, the lists of the people, so that Jesus, for instance, could show that he in fact came from Abraham and from David and all the way back to Adam. As we open the New Testament, we find those genealogies. Don't just read through those. They have some important information. That's my 2 bits for today. All right. Why was money collected at the time that they were building this altar?
Hire the contractors.
All right. To hire contractors to do what? Yeah, they were going to lay the foundation for the temple, so that they contributed money, they collected money to start the foundation. What was their intent at this time, do you think? Seems like they planned to rebuild the temple. That got delayed, and we'll read more about that as we get into chapter 4 and following, because opposition from the people around picks up and it stops. Once the foundation of the temple is laid, the building on the temple stops and is completed many years later. And that's why the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, and particularly Haggai, really are scolding the people about, you're living in your paneled houses and the temple of God still is in ruins. So God sent prophets to spur them on to do the work in Haggai, just a foreknowledge. But they collected money at this time to pay the contractors, as Peggy says, to start the foundation of the temple, the materials they needed and the work they needed to do that.
John?
Yes.
I think it's interesting how Cyrus, who had them in captivity and allowed them to return, had the foreknowledge and the thought. But see, if you don't want to return, you need to give some free will offerings to support those who are returning, so that they have the means, financial means, and so forth to take care of it.
I appreciate that comment, Jeff, because if you look back in chapter 1, where Cyrus's decree is, verse 2 says, Then Cyrus, king of Persia, thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house in Jerusalem. So Cyrus very much took it on himself as a responsibility he had been given to rebuild the temple of God in Jerusalem. And again, that's God working in it through men and through the.
It's also interesting how it allowed those who didn't return to participate in the return.
Yeah, because they contributed money. And as a matter of fact, the Jews that returned were really a small percentage of the total Jews that were in Persia. I have read numbers that maybe 100 years after this, there were something like 1 million Jews living in Persia. There wouldn't be nearly that many living in Judea at that time. So those 50,000 or so that came back, and of course there's going to be a few more come back with Ezra, and maybe some with Nehemiah. We don't have the numbers. And it also seems that Jews could somewhat freely make that trip from Persia to Jerusalem if they wished. I'm sure they had to have some authority to do that. But they could continue to come back to Jerusalem, but most did not. And that's going to be the story of Esther, because Esther is going to tell the story of the Jews that were still in Persia at the time. Peggy?
Let me add, in Psalms 137, is the ballad of the exiles, and you say, like, why did they come back? And verse 4 says, how can we sing one of Yahweh's hymns in a pagan country? Jerusalem, if I forget you, may my right hand wither. So they had learned their lesson and were ready to come back to worship the one true and living God.
Yes, some had anyway. and always there's that remnant. There's always that remnant, a small number, that learn from the lessons that God's trying to teach, and that they'll always come back. All right. So,
real quick. So we haven't gotten this far, but in chapter 6 of Ezra, there's actually the full length of Darius' decree, where it actually says that expenses are to get paid by the royal treasury.
Right.
So at first, I mean, they wanted to get free will offerings, but ultimately Darius said, but the treasury is going to pay for it. So wherever you don't have, we're going to pay for it.
Yep.
Now, we don't read that in chapter 1, but we get that whenever they went back and found in the records Darius' decree.
Exactly. And Darius, of course, was a later king than Cyrus, who is the one that's decreeing in chapter 1 here. So Cyrus' decree was, people go back, I've been commissioned by God to build me a temple. He does give them some resource support, I guess you'd say, from the forest, the wood, and things like that. But he doesn't pay for other workers, which seems to be this collection here in chapter 3. And then, as you say, later, the opposition is going to increase. The enemies are going to make claims about the rebuilding of the temple and the city. And the search is going to be made in the records, and Darius is going to find this decree that Cyrus made here in chapter 1, and he's going to say, you know, this was authorized by the Persian Empire, so I'm going to support it also. So he's doing the same thing.
And Cyrus also took all the silver and gold and vessels that we learned in chapter 2 last week.
Yes.
From the Babylonians.
That the Babylonians had taken, the vessels that the Babylonians had taken. You remember the story of the handwriting on the wall in Daniel. Belshazzar was drinking from some of the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem when he saw the handwriting on the wall. And Cyrus says, much as possible, take those back. But again, no record of the Ark. You know, you have to watch the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark to find out where the Ark went. And it's now in some government warehouse. In D.C. Yeah, in Washington, D.C. Yeah. According to Indiana Jones. All right. How much later did they start? So remember, they're in the 7th month, right? They're rebuilding the altar. And how much later then did they start on the actual foundation of the temple? Yeah, the 2nd year, the 2nd month. So again, 12 months. So it was about 7 months later that they started. Is that pretty good, you think? Took a while to collect the resources and get the people going. So, and it's a sort of a government project. So it took 7 months. I think is not too bad.
Moving quickly, right?
Huh? They're moving quickly. That's right. Yeah. And they're already over budget. supervise the work. Verses 8 and 9 lists who supervised the work on the foundation of the temple. It says they appointed Levites from 20 years old and upward to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. And Jeshua, who you remember is the high priest, with his sons and brothers, and Kadmiel, his sons, the sons of Judah, together supervised the workmen in the house of God, along with the sons of Henadad and the Levites, their sons and brothers. So generally, who supervised the work? The Levites and the priests supervised the work. But the work, of course, was being done by people who had the skills to do the work. But it was being supervised by the Levites and priests, which would be logical for the rebuilding of the temple, that they would be involved in that work. All right, how did they celebrate? Look at verses 10 and 11. And Jackson, would you read verses 10 and 11? You don't, what?
I don't have them. Bible, unless you want me to read
okay.
But
all right.
It's not really textual.
Scott, would you read verses 10 and 11 on chapter 3?
Sure. And
Or Jackson.
Sure. Well, don't you want to hear his style, Jackson? And when the builders laid the foundation of the temple of the Lord, the priests in their vestments came forward with trumpets, and the Levites and the Asaph with cymbals to praise the Lord according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And they sang responsively, praising and giving thanks to the Lord. For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever toward Israel. And all the people shouted with a great shout when they praised the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid.
All right, thank you, Scott. So how did they celebrate?
They put on their best clothes and they had a party.
They sang, they played, they praised God. It's a great thing, isn't it? A great thing. Many beginnings have great beginnings. But we're going to find, again, I'm giving you a spoiler alert here, when we get over into chapter 4, that the opposition from the people around are going to increase. And in fact, this great beginning is not going to be carried forward very quickly. But this is a great beginning for them here. They're playing instruments, they're singing, they're giving praise to God, they're shouting. This had to be a very noisy celebration here in the laying of the temple. And why would that be encouraging to them? They would be able to worship God fully as God intended, except for the ark. So Indiana Jones again, he has to come along to help them out. I find it interesting here in verse 10 that it talks about according to the directions of David, king of Israel. And my question is, how long had it been since David had directed this? We're in about 538 BC. When did David reign? Yeah. Let's say round about 500 years earlier. So it's interesting to me that they still remember, or they still have records of what David instructed 500 years earlier, because David set up the worship of the temple with the players and the singers, and even you find Asaph was mentioned there. He was one of the ones 500 years ago that David commissioned to do that. And so they are still following this direction that David had given 500 years earlier. You know, what does that say? That we are capable of keeping God's will if we'll continue to refresh our information of it, our knowledge of it. So they were worshiping just as David had directed. Was everyone celebrating?
No.
Yeah, look at verse 12. It says, but many of the priests and Levites and heads of fathers' houses, old men who had seen the first house, wept with a loud voice when they saw the foundation of this house being laid, though many shouted aloud for joy. So it was a celebration, but it was a mixed celebration. Everybody was making a sound. Some of them were sounds of joy and some of them were not. Now, why would they be sad, unhappy, when they thought about this new temple?
Was it smaller?
It was not smaller. That's an interesting question. It was actually large. It was actually larger than the first temple. Let's just take a moment and look here. Look at, Gary, if you will, turn to 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 2. 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 2. And read that, if you will.
1 Kings 6:2. The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 wide, and 30 high.
Okay. Now, I want you to look over here in Ezra chapter 6 and verse 3, where the Cyrus has commanded, its height shall be 60 cubits. Yes. What was the height of that one, Gary? Are you still there? No. Okay. Yeah. The height should be 60 cubits. I believe yours was 40. Okay. And its breadth 60 cubits. In other words, its width was 60 cubits, whereas the original temple was 40 by 30. And it doesn't say what its length is, but I presume it was a square, so it's probably 60 by 60. And 60 cubits high, or 60 by 60 by 20 by 30 was the original, and this one's probably 60 by 60 by maybe 60.
Would they have had to have authority to change the dimensions of it?
Good question.
I'm not thinking about the Noah's Ark, but it seems like that everything's specific, that they're just changing the dimensions. I don't know if they are authorized to do that. I
don't know. This was Cyrus's decree to build it at the size there, and we find in chapter 6. So they're following the decree of the Persian king. So he certainly had the authority to tell them what to do. And, there's no indication that God instructed them otherwise that I see. So
it must not been as majestic, or maybe not as much gold,
Who built that first one? Solomon. And as Gina's saying here, if you've ever seen renderings of that first temple, the inside of it was just covered with gold. This one, not so much.
Well, also right now we're just at the foundation too. So
that's right.
Nothing's built yet.
That's right. All you can see is the foundation.
So it could just be that maybe they were weeping for what the rest of the city looked like, and what it's not. What's not there.
Yeah, and we're not told why they're sad. Just that they're looking at it, or we assume they're sad. Maybe they're weeping for joy, but it really doesn't indicate that, does it?
Okay, so my verse 12 says they had seen with their own eyes the earlier temples.
Right.
So that's why they were weeping, because they knew what Solomon had built. And if you can imagine, if you go downtown and see the courthouse, how beautiful the marble is, and then look at a new building, it's different.
Yeah.
It's just not the same.
Yeah. But again, this is just the foundation they're seeing. And, they're apparently sad because it lacks the grandeur of the first one, but that's just an assumption.
That's also can be old men looking backwards, thinking, it's just not the same as it used to be.
Yeah, that's right. I'm in that category of the good old days. They weren't all so good; they were just old. And but sometimes your memory is better than the actual, and so maybe they're weeping for that. Okay. All right, we've got just a few minutes left, so I want to come back to this question that I asked you earlier, is what is the connection between worship and fear, or lack of fear? We read that over in verse 3, where it says, they set the altar, for fear was on them because of the people of the lands. So what is the connection between worship and fear?
It seems like fear has a way of stimulating people back to a higher power.
To draw closer to God?
We think of things that have happened in our country, and I heard the expression from a professor at Christian brothers, and he would say there's no atheists in foxholes.
Mm.
And then you think about 9/11 and other things that have happened. That, and even people you know, sometimes if they're having a family crisis, if they know you're a believer in God, they'll pray for my son,
Yep.
pray for my family. Now, it's something about those times of crisis tend to pull people back.
Yeah, but somebody said also, you know, that they banned prayer in schools, but as long as there are tests, there will be prayer in schools. So, you know, it's the same sort of thing. When there is a crisis, when there is pressure, we as Christians especially, but even people in general, seem to feel the need to appeal or to draw closer to a higher power. Yes, Peggy?
And also the commandment they were taught was to fear God and keep His commandments. And they had not done that, and that's how they ended up in exile in the first place.
Yeah. But that's a different kind of fear than you read about here, isn't it? The fear of the people around them. When we talk about the fear of God, what does that mean? We're afraid of God?
That was part of the promises that He gave them when they left the wilderness. If you do this, you will always be protected from all the people and all these kinds of things, the wild animals that they came through the wilderness. So they understood when they went to places like Ai, I think, off the top of my head, where people were giants, and they were afraid. They were like, we don't have to fear because God is with us.
Yeah.
So it was the connectedness between the worship and the fear of God and protection from all things.
But the point I was making is the fear of God is not being afraid of God. It's having a respect and an awe of God, whereas the fear we read about here is an emotional thing. Right. They're in fear of their lives from the people around them. And that often drives people to God.
Because then their hearts have been converted and they understand. If this is out of my hands, there's nothing I can do. I have to depend on God.
Right.
I have to trust God.
But what happens sometimes when the fear goes away?
You go back to your old way.
Yeah, and that happens with them. It happens with us. It happens with them. But fear will often drive us to God as it did to them. And so they felt the need to rebuild the altar and to begin the sacrifices, to begin the worship of God again as it had been according to His law. All right. For Wednesday, we will cover chapter 4. I don't like to use that word cover. We will study chapter 4. Cover it seems to mean we're going to put something over it. So, any questions or thoughts about the things we talked about today? Check in the room from time to time and see if the books. I'm sure there'll be a note that goes out that the books are in, but check in the room and use your books to prepare. Thank you for your attention. Be quiet in the hall. Jeff, would you turn that TV off? There's a power button right there on the, yeah. Thank you. Yep.
That's a highlight of your day, right?
Thank you, John. Big issue.
So I'm about ready to say I need to go to the end.
We got a few minutes.
So when I had COVID, I had so then a couple of weeks
Esther, I even missed a couple of Esther.
Hi, John.
That was the most I had. Yeah, remedial.
So about the end of January, I finally came out and founded Nehemiah. And I was okay for about 3 weeks until I got the flu. And now I don't know if it's, yeah, so I don't know if it's remnant
No,
or less of the flu or. Exactly. So, but I mean, okay.
I had kind of a fallout driving down the street.
And the thing,
There's no sickness on the tire. 8 hours last night. 8 hours last night. You just one thing in the throat.
so I'm just glad it's off. I mean, this is something.
I mean, when I had
Amen.